It's now just over half a century since the opening of one of the most significant events in the life of the Christian Church in the 20th century, the Roman Catholic Church's great meeting in Rome in the early 60s, known as the Second Vatican Council. With me today I have Dr. Francisca Rumsey, who lived through the Council and saw many of the changes that it brought about come and affect her and her life. Francisca, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us about Vatican II and its impact.
It had a particular impact on me because I made my first vows as a nun on the day that Vatican II actually began, probably just at the same time the bishops were processing into St. Peter's. So I've always felt just a little bit responsible for it. And it also meant that I was a young sister, a young religious in the years immediately following Vatican II, which were years of tremendous excitement and enthusiasm and this feeling of change bubbling up and something completely new beginning. It was just such a time of new life, and lots of experiments were going around, like there was a recipe for proper bread for the Eucharist, which was really quite horrendous. It had honey and all kinds of things in it. But this was what was happening in the days, the weeks and the months after Vatican II. I think after that initial burst of enormous enthusiasm and the feeling that you were at the beginning of something quite tremendous, that evaporated, particularly I think during the last two pontificates, when a lot of the insights and what was reckoned to be new thinking of Vatican II was not encouraged. The whole concept of decentralization vanished. The ideas about developing research and new thinking were not encouraged. Theologians were silenced if their ideas were deemed to be a little too adventurous. I think looking back and reading over the documents of Vatican II, we realise in that 50-something years we've already moved a long way from Vatican II in the language that we use. The Decree on Religious Life talks about being in the army of Christ and the search for perfection. I don't think anybody would use that kind of language nowadays, and of course you wouldn't say brothers without mentioning sisters, which was not an issue 50-something years ago.
The other interesting thing is that reading some of the documents today, one can see that they're still thinking of the Christian Church really very much in terms of just the Western Catholic Church. And yet Vatican II was opening up to the fact that there were other Christians. There was the famous rapprochement between Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras. There was the famous praying together with Archbishop Michael Ramsey. At one level, of course, the genie can't be put back into the bottle, and even the most conservative Christians, the most conservative Catholics, have to acknowledge the reality of a larger Christianity. But also there seems to be a fearfulness about, there was an embracing culture in Vatican II, and it seemed that you said it was deflation, but I seem to think it was also, there was a new fearfulness.
I think the result that we're living with now is going in two directions, and there's a very strong tension between them. On one hand, you get people, I think, quite a lot of young people who are trying to go back to as they imagined the church was before Vatican II, which actually exists only in their imagination. They're not old enough to have known what it really was like. And then you get a completely different outlook, which is frustrated because the enormous potential of Vatican II hasn't actually yet been tapped. And I say that there's great tension between those two outlooks.
So you, at one level, looking back as a historian, you can, I think of here as a product of the early 1960s, and in many ways the product of a highly centralised church and a church that really knew only one mode of thinking, neo-scholasticism, and I still see the jargon. Whereas you're actually saying, okay, it's actually unrealised potential. Vatican II is not history but agenda still.
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Would you like to tease out where you think that agenda is going to lead us?
I think there's enormous potential there for liturgy. Sacrosanctum Concilium, which the Vatican document on the liturgy, which was the first one that they actually produced, we still haven't really plumbed the depth of that.
And of course you're the editor of Anaphora, which is one of the editors of Anaphora, which is actually one of the journals trying to explore new ways.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And instead of looking back to a Latin liturgy, a liturgy that's really straight out of the Council of Trent, with a new translation that hasn't actually improved matters at all, we should be looking forward, not backwards.
Cyril Vogel remarked, I think in the early 70s, he said something like, liturgy had been alienated because there was a gap between liturgy and people. I hear you saying that gap is still there, and that's something that needs to be bridged.
I think we've tried to take steps across that gap. I mean, the laity, I don't like that phrase, but I don't know quite what else to use, are much more involved in the liturgy, at least in some parishes. I think that was another result of Vatican II, that the laity suddenly discovered that they weren't invisible, that they'd got a contribution to make, and that holiness wasn't something just for priests and nuns, but that Lumen Gentium and the universal call to holiness, this is for everybody, and it is through the liturgy that we express our worship of God and therefore grow in that holiness.
Are you optimistic?
I'd like to be.
Francisca, thank you very much.